Hi, I'm Grace, and this is the story of how the sister who once framed me for theft asked me to make her wedding beautiful, like none of it ever happened. She sent an invitation with gold lettering, no apology, and a note asking for my floral touch. 6 years after ruining my life. But I didn't go back to forgive her. I went to finish what she started. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever had to smile in the face of someone who broke you? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is not just a wedding story. It's a story of roots, revenge, and who remembers when the music stops. They say time softens the edges of old wounds. But when I opened that envelope and saw her name in gold, my hands remembered everything my heart wanted to forget. It was a thick envelope, weighty in that self-important way. Cream stock, embossed lettering, and a scent that reminded me of department stores in December. Cold, perfumed, and distant. Inside, a wedding invitation, Clarissa Delaney and Gregory Hadley. The names curled in golden script like they'd been etched into stone. I ran my thumb over the wax seal, unbroken, but loud with implication. I hadn't heard from Clarissa in 6 years, not since the day she'd looked me in the eye and told Mom and Dad that I had stolen from her. Jewelry, cash, a family locket. Gone. And suddenly, I was gone too, pushed out with no chance to explain. I left with what fit in a duffel and the dignity I could carry. Now she wants me back? Or at least, if I was available, the invitation said. And in smaller print, Grace, would love your help with the floral design. Not even a phone call. Not even a, we'd love to have you. Just assumed, like always, that I'd say yes. The audacity of it made my chest tighten. But so did something else. A pull I didn't want to name. I set the envelope down on the kitchen table, beside a jar of lavender honey and my old garden gloves. My fingers itched, not from anger, but from memory. Outside, the sun had already slanted low, gilding the lavender rose out back. My hands, still dirt-caked from pruning, rested on my knees. The quiet of the Vermont evening settled around me like a soft blanket. Crickets chirped. A wind chime twitched lazily by the window. I should have tossed the envelope, let it join the compost with the rest of what Clarissa thought I was worth. But something in me stirred. Something not quite bitter, but not quite finished. Maybe it was the part of me that never stopped replaying that day. The look in Mom's eyes when I packed. Not sad. Not confused. Just resolved. Like she'd already picked a side. Later that week, I brought fresh-cut stems to Mrs. Warner, a client of mine, pushing 92 and still more observant than most. She peeked at me over her glasses as I arranged peonies in her parlor vase. "You've got a look in your eye," she said, voice gravelly with age and truth. "Old ghosts," I muttered. "Some silence needs to be broken, not carried," she replied, and poured me tea into a chipped porcelain cup with violets painted along the rim. The same kind she'd used when I was a teenager, after my first heartbreak, when she let me cry without asking questions. Back home, I walked to the bookshelf and pulled out a photo album I hadn't opened in years. There we were, Clarissa and I in matching Easter dresses, holding baskets we'd outgrown but still insisted on using. There was our grandmother's porch swing, where I once told Clarissa I wanted to be a florist. She laughed, said, "That's cute. But flowers die, Grace. Pick something that lasts." Now she wanted my help making her wedding beautiful, with flowers. The next morning, I found myself at the cafe downtown, Bean and Birch, where the walls smelled of dark roast and lemon bars, and the barista knew how to stay quiet. I sat by the window with my tea, watching the square, watching faces. An older couple shared a croissant in silence. A little boy pressed his face to the glass of the bookstore next door. Everything felt exactly the same, and yet, I wasn't. And then I saw him, Joel Whitman. We'd been in high school together. He was 2 years old, always carrying a camera and a kind of silence that made people uncomfortable. We hadn't spoken much back then, but he had been there that week, Clarissa accused me. Hadn't said a word. He passed by the cafe window and paused. Our eyes met for half a second. He nodded, subtle, nothing flashy, but I saw it. A glimmer of recognition, of maybe, I don't know, regret? That nod sat with me longer than I expected. Maybe longer than it should have. I went home, cleaned my shears, packed a weekend bag, and checked my truck's tires. I wasn't returning for her. I wasn't going for closure. I wasn't going to forgive. I was going to finish something. I placed the envelope back on the table. She hadn't forgotten me. Not really. This wasn't an olive branch. It was bait. The air in Belmare hadn't changed. Still smelled of pine and porch swings. But this time, I wasn't the girl they whispered about. I was the woman who remembered. The truck tires hummed over the familiar cracked pavement as I turned off the main road and into town. The bell on the hardware store door still jingled when someone entered. Mrs. Wells still hung buntings on her porch, even though it wasn't Memorial Day. And the house next to hers, still white, still peeling, held the same wind chimes shaped like teacups. I passed the bakery where Clarissa and I used to buy jelly donuts on Saturdays, when we still wore our hair in matching braids and believed sisters were forever. The sign hadn't changed, but the owner had. No more free sprinkles or extra napkins. No one waved. I parked by the community library and sat there for a minute, engine idling. Across the street, the window of Whitman Photography was dark. Joel's name still painted in gold cursive on the door. I hadn't realized he'd stayed. Or maybe he hadn't. Maybe, like me, he had returned. The town looked the same, but I was different. That had to count for something. I made my way to a narrow street just off Maple and stopped at the faded blue fence with the tangled honeysuckle. The Granger house. I'd spent summers weeding her garden in exchange for lemonade and stories about her years in New York. I used to sit cross-legged on her porch, listening to tales of Central Park in the 60s, of train stations and typewriters, and jazz clubs I'd never see. Now, the place looked like it hadn't aged at all. The paint curled a bit more at the corners, but the old woman still opened the door the same way, like she'd been expecting me. "Well," she said, squinting, "if it isn't Miss Delaney." "It's Grace," I replied, stepping in. "Always was," she said, then added, "You're late." She led me to the kitchen, still smelling of cinnamon and floor wax. The same floral wallpaper clung stubbornly to the walls. On the table was a ceramic teapot and 2 mismatched cups, just like old times. A tiny radio played jazz in the background, Miles Davis, I think, and the house, for all its silence, felt more alive than anything else I'd stepped into lately. "I saw your name in the paper," she said, pouring tea. "Clarissa's big wedding, front page fluff." I sipped in silence. "You coming to spectate or to speak?" "I'm doing the flowers." Her brows lifted. Lord help them. We talked for a while, mostly in half sentences and careful silences. She didn't ask why I was really there. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she'd always known. When I stood to leave, she motioned to a small wooden box on the side table. "He left it on my porch," she said. "The day after the fight. I didn't look inside. Figured it wasn't my story." Inside was a small flash drive taped to an index card. In Clarissa's handwriting, "Do not touch. See." I stared at it. There's a reason people lock things up. she said softly. But sometimes it's because they know the truth won't stay buried. Back in my truck, I held the drive in my palm. It was light, absurdly so for something that might carry so much weight. I didn't plug it in. Not yet. Instead, I drove by the church, the one with the cemetery behind it. My grandmother's headstone was near the back, under a crooked oak. I hadn't visited in years, not since everything fell apart. I stepped out, walked over, and stood there, not really praying, just remembering. She would have told me to plant something. That was her way of healing, gardens, not grief. She used to say forgiveness doesn't come from letting go of pain, but from using it to grow something softer. And maybe that's what I'd do when this was over. Plant something new? On my way out of the cemetery, I passed Joel. He was standing near the gate, camera slung over one shoulder. His jacket was dusty at the collar, and his gaze was steady, unreadable. We didn't speak, just exchanged nods. Maybe that's all I could ask for right now. As I stepped back outside, the wind caught my hair, and for a moment, I swear I smelled lavender and locket polish. Clarissa always knew how to dress a scene, but even the prettiest bouquet can't stop something rotten from seeping through. The wedding was 3 days away. I stood inside the reception barn, staring up at beams strung with fairy lights and mason jars filled with baby's breath. Someone had gone all out. Whitewashed wood, embroidered linen napkins, candlesticks wrapped in ivy. It looked effortless. But I knew the effort, knew what it took to make something seem gentle, simple. Knew how easy it was to hide the worst of a place beneath something fragrant. Clarissa swept in wearing a tailored white sundress, clipboard in hand. She didn't look surprised to see me among the buckets of florals. She never looked surprised. That was part of her trick. "Grace," she said, like it was just any Tuesday and we hadn't spent years in silence. "Peonies arrived?" "They're in the cooler," I replied, snipping the end of a dusty Miller stem. She smiled. A politician's smile. "Make sure they open on schedule. The lighting's tricky here, and I don't want wilted faces." I looked at her. Really looked. The manicure, the precise part in her hair, the voice smoothed of anything soft. She'd built her life out of polished edges, but I remembered what was underneath. The cracks, the tantrums, the time she cut holes in my sketchbook and blamed the dog. "Anything else?" I asked. She hesitated. "There's a family brunch tomorrow, at the house. You're welcome to come." I blinked. "You mean the house I was kicked out of?" Her lips twitched. "That's in the past. It would mean a lot to Mom." "Would it?" She didn't answer, just turned and walked out, her heels making crisp sounds on the wooden floor. Later that night, I finally plugged the USB drive into my laptop. A single video file blinked to life, grainy security footage from the old flower shop my parents used to run. The timestamp was from the week I'd been accused. I watched as the camera caught Clarissa unlocking the back door. She moved with purpose, not panicked, not confused. She opened the register, took out envelopes, then walked straight to the display case and removed the locket. My locket. There it was. Undeniable. I stared at the screen, my breath shallow. The silence in the room pressed in tight. I should have felt rage, maybe. But mostly, I felt tired. Tired that it had taken this long. Tired that I'd been alone with the lie for so long. Have you ever felt like I do now? The feeling of being an extra, invisible person in your own family, carrying the weight of a lie while everyone else moves on. If you've ever been pushed aside like you didn't matter, please leave a comment number 8 below. Now, let's get to the next development of this story. I copied the file to a clean USB stick and tucked it into a velvet box I'd saved from an old customer order. The next morning, I slipped it into the inner pocket of my satchel, just beneath the tape measure and garden shears. At the brunch, Clarissa's fiancé, Gregory, greeted me like we were old friends. "Glad you made it," he said warmly, holding a tray of fruit tarts. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, eyes scanning the room. Mom looked up from the patio table, her face pinched, polite. "You look well." "I am." She didn't ask more. Inside, I wandered toward the parlor. The same piano I learned sat against the far wall, silent and perfect. On the mantel, a row of silver frames. One was new, a photo of Clarissa and Gregory in Rome, locked in a posed kiss beneath a fountain. I felt the velvet box in my pocket. My fingers tightened. Back in the kitchen, Joel appeared at the doorway. "Didn't think I'd see you here," he said quietly. "Neither did I." He nodded toward the window. "Are you going to show her?" "I'm going to give her the chance not to lie anymore." He nodded. "I've got my camera, just in case." The next morning, I returned to the barn early, set up a small table behind the cake stand, draped it with soft blue cloth. At the center, a single vase of white peonies, and the velvet box, unopened. Clarissa arrived 2 hours later, eyes scanning the room. She walked toward the display, stopped short, and saw it. The box. The flash drive inside. She looked at me. I didn't say anything. You'd be amazed how quiet a wedding crowd can get, especially when silence walks in holding the truth. The sun hung low over Belmare's hills, casting golden streaks across the field behind the Grange barn. Guests in pastel linen and pressed collars sipped champagne under gauzy drapes. Laughter carried like birdsong, and someone's uncle had already loosened his tie. Inside, everything was lavender and lace and soft background jazz. Clarissa had chosen white peonies, my peonies, for every table, and the air was thick with their fragrance. No one would ever guess what they'd bloomed over. I stood near the back of the barn, half hidden behind the dessert table. My hair was pinned up with a silver clasp I hadn't worn in years. One Grandma gave me when I graduated high school, the same week Clarissa reported the locket stolen. The flash drive was tucked safely in the velvet box again. I had placed it at the edge of the gift table, beside a card marked, "To the bride from the past." Joel had tested the projector earlier. A small monitor now sat ready to display the floral slideshow Clarissa had requested. Except, of course, it wasn't going to be roses and hydrangeas. Clarissa entered the barn exactly on cue, radiant in a custom sheath dress with a sweetheart neckline. She smiled like she owned the air in the room. Gregory trailed behind her, polished and pleasant, but a little too distracted, like maybe he'd noticed the tension in her spine that the others hadn't. She stopped when she saw the velvet box. I watched from across the room, fingers pressed flat against the wood of the dessert cart. She hesitated just a second too long before opening it. Then her face didn't change. Not exactly, but the smile stalled. The tension bloomed. She tucked the box closed with one careful motion and set it back down. The slideshow began a moment later, just as she stepped up to thank the crowd. At first, the screen showed arrangements: spring bouquets, bridesmaid posies, a close-up of anemones in a mason jar. Then the screen glitched. Then the video started. It wasn't dramatic. No gasps at first. The resolution was grainy, the angle unremarkable. But anyone who had worked in the Delaney flower shop would recognize it instantly. The register, the locket display, the back door, and Clarissa. Every movement played out in full. The unlocking, the envelope, the locket. Her hand on the cash drawer, confident, unbothered. A ripple spread through the crowd like a breeze before a storm. Chairs shifted, forks paused midair, and Clarissa froze at the mic, lips parted, but no words coming. Gregory turned toward the screen, then to her. She reached for the remote. It wasn't there. Joel stood beside the control panel, arms folded, camera hung low and still. "I don't know what this is," Clarissa said finally, her voice straining for composure. I stepped forward. Not grandly, not for applause, just enough to be seen. "It's yours," I said simply. "It's been yours the whole time." "You?" she started, but didn't finish. The crowd waited. No one interrupted. Even the server stood still. Gregory took a slow breath. "Did you ever tell them?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but in that silence, it felt like thunder. Clarissa looked at him, then at me, then back to the screen. "I was 16, she said. I didn't mean for it to matter." And maybe that was true. Maybe back then it was just a teenage lie to cover a mistake. But it mattered. It had followed me into every job interview, every new town, into every conversation with Mom that turned cold too fast, into every glance from someone who didn't ask questions because they thought they already knew. Clarissa didn't cry. Clarissa didn't yell. She just turned, heels clicking across the wood, and disappeared out the barn door. And for the first time in years, no one followed her. You find out who really saw you when the spotlight fades, and who only watched the show. The morning after the wedding, Belmare lay hushed under a gray sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain. It felt like the town had exhaled, like the tension had slipped away with the last of the champagne bottles and fairy lights. I sat on the porch swing outside the guest house, nursing a mug of chamomile tea that had long gone cold. Across the gravel drive, the field was damp with dew, and a mourning dove cooed somewhere close. The quiet wrapped around me, not heavy this time, just honest. Clarissa hadn't come back after she stormed out of the barn. Someone said she'd driven to her in-laws' place upstate. Someone else said she left her phone behind on purpose. In a town like this, stories sprouted faster than the wildflowers off the roadside. But none of them mattered anymore. What mattered was what people hadn't said. As they left the reception, some nodded at me. Others offered half smiles. No one looked away. Joel stopped by just after 10, carrying 2 paper cups of black coffee and a Polaroid. "Brought proof," he said, setting the photo gently on the swing between us. It was a still frame from the moment Clarissa realized what was on the screen. Her hand half raised, her mouth slightly open. Around her, the crowd blurred in motion. She was the only one completely still. I stared at it for a long time, not out of spite, just trying to understand how much of what I remembered was ever real. "She froze like that for a good 15 seconds, Joel added. "It was something." "She always did hate surprises," I murmured. Joel sipped his coffee. "You gonna stay in town?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe long enough to clear out some ghosts. Maybe longer." He didn't press. Later that day, I drove toward the house I grew up in. It looked the same from the outside, the white paint still chipped at the corners, the porch swing still crooked. The air smelled like damp grass and something sweet, honeysuckle maybe. I rang the bell. It didn't work, just like always, so I knocked. Mom opened the door in a soft blue sweater, her hair pulled back like it had been every morning of my childhood. Her face was unreadable. "Clarissa?" I asked. She shook her head slowly. "She left. No words." I hesitated, then stepped inside. The living room was spotless, not in the comfortable, lived-in way, but in that too quiet aftermath of something that had come undone. The piano in the corner sat open. Sheet music spread like a question left unanswered. A soft classical track played from the old stereo. Debussy, maybe. I used to play it when I couldn't sleep. Mom sat in her usual chair, her tea cooling on the side table. She didn't offer me any. "I didn't know," she said after a while. "You didn't ask," I replied, gently but without heat. She looked out the window, then back at me. "It's easier to believe the person who gives you neat stories. Clarissa always did that. You didn't." "I never learned how," I said. She gave a small, brittle laugh. "Maybe I never wanted you to." Silence settled again. Not sharp, just soft around the edges. "She made a mistake," Mom said finally. "We all did," I agreed, but mine was letting everyone believe hers. Sometimes the worst pain isn't what they say, but knowing they don't care if it's true. If you've ever stood alone with the truth while everyone else looked away, please comment number 9 below. Let's keep going. This story isn't over yet. She turned to me. For the first time in years, really looked. "I'm sorry," she said. It came out thin, but it was there. We didn't hug. That wasn't us. But something eased. Before I left, I pulled the Polaroid from my coat and placed it gently on the kitchen counter. "She'll come back," Mom said, not quite asking. "Maybe," I answered, "but next time I'll be harder to erase." And as I stepped outside, I realized the garden bed under the kitchen window had bloomed again, with flowers I hadn't planted. The flowers on Clarissa's wedding arch wilted faster than anyone expected. I heard the florist had to replace them before the reception even ended. I didn't offer to help. It had been 5 days since the wedding. The town had shifted back into its summer rhythm. Farmers setting up at the Thursday market, teens loitering outside the ice cream shop, retirees arguing gently over crossword puzzles at the library. Belmare moved on, but not without noticing. Not this time. I stayed. At first, because I didn't know what else to do. But the longer I stayed, the more the soil under my feet felt like it still remembered me. Mrs. Granger called one morning and asked if I'd help her repot her porch plants. She didn't say it, but I think she just wanted company. She brewed Earl Grey and made toast with apple butter, and when we sat down to rest, she pulled out an old box of letters, ones I'd written her from college, back when I thought I could still belong to 2 worlds at once. "You always wrote like you were watching things from the edge," she said, sorting through the yellowed envelopes. "Maybe I was," I replied. "It was safer there." She looked at me, her eyes glassy but clear. "That's not where things grow, Grace." The next day, I drove out to the greenhouse that had been shuttered for nearly 4 years. Delaney Flowers. The sign was still bolted crookedly above the door, paint faded and the R missing. Inside, it smelled like dust and old fertilizer. The shelves were bare. The walk-in cooler hadn't run in years. But the light? The light still poured through the glass in long golden lines, like it was waiting for something to bloom. I spent the afternoon sweeping. Then I drove to town hall, asked about permits, listened to an old man named Don explain the water line situation while chewing the same stick of cinnamon gum for 45 minutes. By evening, I had a folder full of forms and an ache in my chest I hadn't felt in years. Hope. That night, Joel met me at Bean and Birch. He ordered chamomile for me without asking. We sat in the corner booth, where the wood was scratched with old initials and hearts long outlived. "You staying for good?" he asked after a while. I nodded. "For now." He smiled into his cup. Belmare could use someone who sees the edges. We didn't say much after that, but it was the kind of silence that plants roots. The next morning, a package arrived at the guest house. No return address, just my name, written in Clarissa's sharp, unmistakable hand. Inside was a letter. Grace. I'm not asking for anything, but I owe you more than silence. I watched the footage a dozen times, not because I doubted it, but because I needed to see who I was back then. I'm still trying to figure that out. Gregory left, or maybe I let him. Either way, it's quieter now, and in that quiet, I hear things I never wanted to admit. You deserved better. The locket. I've sent it to the lawyer. He said it's legally yours, though I know that's not why you're doing any of this. I hope the greenhouse lives again. I hope something good comes out of what I broke. Clarissa. I folded the letter slowly, not gently. I wasn't angry, but I didn't feel sorry for her either. It wasn't forgiveness I felt. It was something harder, something earned. Distance. That afternoon, I opened the greenhouse doors wide for the first time in years. The wind stirred dust from the rafters, but it didn't feel cold. Just ready. I made a list: soil, trays, starter plants, a new sign. At the bottom, I scribbled a name: Second Bloom. Mrs. Granger offered to help with accounting. Joel said he'd take photos for a website. Even Mrs. Warner, 92 and sharp as thistle, dropped off a wicker basket of garden gloves and lucky socks. That weekend, I planted the first tray of seeds. Lavender. Not because it sells well, but because it's what I remember. Its smell in the kitchen windowsill, in the folds of my childhood, in the air outside the barn the night I walked out. I pressed the soil down gently, then sat back and watched the sunlight catch the glass. The truth didn't fix everything, but it opened the windows. And sometimes that's all a thing needs to grow. Some truths don't knock. They wait, quietly, for someone brave enough to open the door. That summer morning in Belmare, as I stood among seedlings and second chances, I realized I hadn't just come home. I'd grown into someone who could stay. When we stop measuring people by their silence, by their scars, or by the stories others tell about them, we begin to recognize the quiet weight of character. Kindness, after all, often arrives in the softest forms: an old letter, a neighbor's nod, or the scent of lavender from a life once misunderstood. Like wildflowers blooming through cracked pavement, compassion grows strongest where judgment once stood. If this story reminded you of someone you haven't spoken to in a while, maybe today's the day to reach out. And if it brought a little warmth to your evening, consider leaving a comment below or subscribing so we can keep sharing stories that matter. Because sometimes the smallest truths leave the longest echoes.